Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me today on this Lunch and Learn session today on the 6th of March. Just as people are joining, I will go through some quick pieces of housekeeping, some introductions, and talk through the brief agenda that we've got on this session today. So my name is Gillian Askew. I'm one of the co-founders of Go for Growth, and I'll be your host for today, for the webinar for today. The session is being recorded, so a copy of the recording will be sent out to all of the registered attendees, along with a copy of the slide deck. So please don't worry about taking too many notes in the session today. You can ask questions, as always, on Zoom, using either the chat function or the Q&A function. If you want to introduce yourself and say hi, please feel free via the chat function. Just make sure that it's set to who you want to see it. I think the options are either host and panelist or everybody. If you do have questions, if you can use the Q&A function, that will be really helpful, but I will keep an eye on both as we go. We have got the session today set up for 30 minutes maximum. Oh, it looks like the chat function is disabled. Okay, apologies for that. I don't know why the chat function is disabled. Thank you, David, for letting me know. If you do want to put anything in the Q&A, that looks like it's working okay. So please feel free to use the Q&A functionality. We'll be covering the standard selection questionnaire today. What we're trying to do is have 20 minutes on the standard selection questionnaire, and then there will be 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. If there is anything that you need me to cover whilst we're going through it, we'll do that, or we'll cover the Q&A in the 10 minutes at the end. So please feel free to ask questions as we go through. So what we're covering today is the SSQ, the standard selection questionnaire. I'm going to work through each of the sections, giving an overview of what's required. We'll cover things like mandatory and discretionary exclusions, but we will cover all 8 sections in today's session. As it is a lunch and learn, it will be a quick fire session. So if you do want any further detail, please do feel free to reach out to myself or my colleague Lauren. Our contact details are on the last slide at the end. So I'll quickly whip through. We'll get started. So at the front end of any procurement, what you'll see is this standard selection questionnaire. There are 8 sections in the SSQ, but depending on how big or complex the procurement is, and in fact, what sector the procurement is in, i.e. social care, where the light touch regime might be being utilised, you might not have to answer all 8 sections. But for today's session, we are going to try and cover all 8. Also, it's worth noting that in any procurement, there will be bidder instructions. So very clear instructions on how to navigate that procurement competition. That can mean there's quite a lot of documents. Please try not to be overwhelmed by those documents, but also they are there to help you. So try to use them as well as you can. They should help you navigate the process. Above all else, you have Go for Growth in your toolkit. So we're a free to use solution with any questions on processes. So if you find yourself in a competition or you're preparing for a competitive process and you do have questions, please do feel free to give us a shout. Like I say, mine and my colleague Lauren's contact details are on the last slide. So please do feel free to get in touch. Also, just before we crack on to section 1, we are launching our new portal shortly. And actually what we've built into the front end of that portal is the standard selection questionnaire. So any sections that are generally used for all procurements. And that can act as a template for you if you want to fill it out in slower time outside of a competition through the Go for Growth process, you can do so. So do keep an eye on social media for when that's launching. So section 1 is all about capturing your details. So it will cover things like your general contact details, the company name, the company registered address, your company website. We'll also ask about your trading status. So whether you're a PLC, a limited company, a sole trader, or a third sector organisation, that kind of thing. It will also ask about your date of registration, your company registration number, and if you are a charity, your charity registration number. It will also ask for your DUNS number. And we often get asked about a DUNS number. You might not have been asked for it before, especially if you're new to the bidding process, and it comes from the Dun & Bradstreet website. What we've made in Go for Growth is a tutorial on how to get your Dun & Bradstreet number, your DUNS number. So in the slide deck and the video that we send out afterwards, we'll also include a link to the video tutorial of how to get your DUNS number. You'll be asked about your VAT number. You'll also be asked about any trade registers, licenses or authorizations. And what actually this is looking for is anything that is relevant and core to your ability to be able to undertake the contract if you were awarded it. So if you have to be registered with CQC, for example, the Care Quality Commission, it's that kind of thing that are looking for. If it's stray dog kennels, if you are licensed to be able to house animals and the right authorizations in the sector that you're in. So it's those things that are really core to your ability to deliver the contract. There's also a section on classification, so really about how you're set up. So are you a voluntary or a community or a social enterprise organisation, a VCSE, or are you a mutual, for example? And also it will ask you if you're a SME. So in the context of this, a SME stands for small to medium enterprise. The definition of what a SME is will be in the definitions in the documents that are in the procurement. But generally speaking, a small organisation is 0 to 49 employees. And the European definition of a medium enterprise is 0 to 249, 50 to 249 employees. Now, the UK government have just changed the definition of SME. So it's up to 499. Which covers up to medium. So it might be that they were using the UK definition or the European definition until we migrate into the new regulatory environment. So my advice would be double check the definition in the documents of what a SME actually is. You'll also be asked about persons of significant control. And that affects both businesses and charities. So if you're a limited company, you can check your persons of significant control at Companies House. If you're a charity, that should also be true. You're obliged as a charity to file a confirmation statement annually, and that would be when you would update your PSC register. So you should be able to get those details from Companies House. If you're completing a bid on behalf of your organisation and you can't find that information, then go to your senior management team and they should be able to help you. You may not have a person of significant control, in which case you don't need to enter it. You will also be asked about parent company details if they're applicable. So if you are part of a wider group of companies and you have a parent company, you would be answering yes to that particular piece of information. Section 1 also looks at the bidding model. So are you bidding as a part of a group of economic operators? And essentially what that means is that you've formed a consortia, if you like, and that might mean that you've also set up a new legal entity in which you're bidding, or it might be that there are multiple companies coming together for the sole purpose of answering this bid competition. One of you would be the lead into which the legal entity into which the contractor is entered, but you will be bidding together, and that makes you a group of economic operators. So if you have that bidding model, you will be answering yes. And that's different from using subcontractors where you haven't come together for the purposes of that bid competition or contract, but you as a legal entity would then be using a subcontractor. And in the context of this, it's usually looking for those subcontractors which are key and core to the delivery and operation of the contract for which you are competing. So if you use subcontractors and they're key to your delivery, you would be answering yes, you would be using subcontractors in the process of going through this competition. In section 1, there's also a contact details section and then a declaration. And that declaration is on behalf of you, you're self-certifying to say that you declare that this is a fair and accurate representation of the information that you have provided. That's also included in section 1. So section 2 starts to look at grounds for exclusion. So when we send the slide deck out with a copy of the video, we'll also send a document round. It's a government document which is available publicly, and it goes into a lot more detail than we've got time to cover today for the grounds of exclusion. However, on screen, what you can see are probably what you would expect to see grounds for mandatory exclusion. They are substantial issues. And what it means is that if you fall foul of any of the things that are on screen, and when I say fall foul, what I mean in terms of having a conviction in these areas, you would likely be excluded from the competition, and that means you're unable to proceed. So one of the things we get asked is, are there any exceptions to this rule? And the answer is that there are very few. What I'm going to read out to you, and I'm going to read it verbatim, is what the government says about exceptions to mandatory exclusions. So in-scope organisations may, and when I say in-scope, we mean a contracting authority who is letting the contract. So in-scope organisations may, in limited circumstances, disregard the existence of any ground for mandatory exclusion. This is confined on an exceptional basis to where there are overriding reasons relating to the public interest, such as public health or protection of the environment. Secondly, the ground for mandatory exclusion for breach of tax and social security obligations no longer applies where the supplier has paid or entered into a binding arrangement with a view to paying the outstanding sums due, including any interest or fines. In addition, this ground may be disregarded where exclusion would be clearly disproportionate, in particular where the unpaid amounts are only minor, or the supplier did not have the opportunity to pay or agree to pay the outstanding amounts prior to the deadline for submitting requests to participate or tender. Those are, generally speaking, the only grounds for mitigation around these mandatory exclusions. Anything else, it is more than likely that you would be excluded and therefore unable to continue. In terms of exclusionary grounds that are discretionary, the regulations allow for but don't mandate that bidders could be excluded under certain grounds. Unlike the mandatory grounds for exclusion, they don't cover specific criminal offences. And so therefore, what that means in practice is the decision to exclude would be taken on a case-by-case basis by the contracting authority who's letting the contract. So generally speaking, if you have found yourself in breach of a labour law obligation, an environmental breach, etc., you would be asked for mitigations around that, what you've done to either mitigate it, what you've done to resolve it, where you're at now. So those things will be on a case-by-case basis. And again, they'll be covered in more detail in the document that we'll send out that accompanies the slide deck. In all cases in a procurement, some sort of economic and financial standing testing will be done. In lay terms, what contracting authorities want to be sure of is that whoever they award to, that they're financially stable enough to deliver the contract throughout the whole life of the contract term. Usually you'll be asked for audited accounts for the last couple of years, but those things in brackets where I say or alternative are really important. The public procurement process can't discriminate against you because you're new to the market. If you're a new entrant, you're diversifying into this, or you're a startup organisation, you must have equal opportunity to be able to enter. And so you'll be asked for alternative ways of demonstrating that financial stability. Usually there are three options to choose from. Audited accounts, cash flow statements, letters from your accountant, that kind of thing. But again, they'll be really clear, but there will be an alternative if you don't have audited accounts for the last couple of years. It is worth noting that there might be, and it isn't always the case, but there might be minimum levels of economic or financial standing that are at play. And what that means is if there are minimum financial thresholds that you need to meet and you don't meet them, it might be that you are excluded at that point, unable to continue, or that other things are asked for if there are some issues like parent company guarantee, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. It will be very clear in the documents that accompany the procurement what the minimum thresholds are and how they work and what to do if you don't meet them. So if you have any questions on that, you should be able to find the information from the procurement documents themselves. In section 5, this is only really relevant if you've indicated that you're part of a wider group. So back in section 1, when it asked if you had a parent company, you're part of a wider group. If you answered yes to that, section 5, you might be asked for therefore additional information. So you might be asked to provide copies of your parent company accounts. And you might be asked for something called a parent company guarantee or an alternative. So an alternative to a parent company guarantee, a PCG, might be a project or a performance bond, for example. They're not limited to construction, but they are more often found in construction. What they effectively do is they guarantee the performance of the contract, or they protect the contracting authority on default of the contract. And they're usually required at time of contract signing. We have got a couple of links to some more information on PCGs that we have found, so we'll send those out also with the document pack after the session today. Section 6 is seeking to understand your experience and your capability in more detail, and it's where you would normally be asked about your references or examples of contracts that you've worked on that demonstrates your capability in the area that the contract is for. If you don't have that relevant experience in terms of contracts that you've already worked on, this might be the first contract that you're going for. You might be a startup, for example, or you might have diversified in there, just as there were with the accounts. There should be an alternative for you to complete. So it might be, for example, the ability to write a narrative about your experience or capability. And I've certainly seen some that give you a 500-word allowance to write that down and tell the contracting authority about what your company does and how you does it. You would obviously only use that alternative if you can't fulfill the reference or the previous experience bit. Usually if they're asking for 3 examples, if you can't give at least 1, then you would be using the alternative. And where you are using subcontractors for core delivery, section 6 might ask you about how you demonstrate healthy supply chains. So what the guidance says at the minute is that evidence on this should include, but not is limited to, details of your supply chain management tracking system. And when it's a supply chain management tracking system, I don't think that that has to be, you know, an Oracle SAP type tracking system, but asking you how you manage your supply chain. And that's all about ensuring performance of the contract and including prompt payment or even membership of the UK prompt payment code or equivalent schemes in other countries. In essence, what they're trying to test is that the way that the contract should be managed from a principal contractor right the way throughout the supply chain, that the contracting authority can rely on their principal contractor to do that. And especially in things like payment, where if the contracting authority is paying their principal contractors in 30 days, they want to be certain that that is being flowed through to subcontractors who are also being paid in 30-day terms as well. And there are some real horror stories out there where that hasn't happened. So in section 6, you might be asked about how you manage your suppliers and how you ensure that those values are honoured throughout the supply chain. Section 7 is concerned with the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. And so it first tries to determine if you are a relevant organisation. So how do you know if you're a relevant organisation? So a commercial organisation is required to publish an annual statement if a certain criteria applies. And I'm going to read out 4 criteria. If all of those criteria applies, then you are a relevant organisation. So you would be a body corporate or a partnership wherever you're incorporated or formed. You would be carrying on a business or part of a business in the UK. You would be supplying goods or services, and you would have an annual turnover of 36 million or more. One of the things the guidance also says that I think is worth pointing out is that organisations themselves are responsible for determining whether the legislation applies to you. So you might want to seek legal advice to decide if your organisation needs to produce an annual modern slavery statement or not. If you are a relevant organisation for modern slavery, then the SSQ will seek to check if you are compliant with the Act of 2015, usually on a self-certification basis. And the final section, section 8, it's called additional questions, but some of these things will definitely be in every procurement. So things like relevant insurances will be checked, and those insurances will be relative to the procurement specifically. So you might be asked for cyber insurance if it's using particular personal data or a SARS contract, software as a solution, for example. You might be asked for construction all risk if it's a construction-based procurement, but the general ones are on screen. So there's employer liability. The guidance says 5 million minimum. In my experience, it's usually always 10 million that's asked for. You'd be asked for public liability, generally speaking 2 or 5, but you might be asked for 10 million on public liability also. Professional indemnity insurance, which is usually around 1 or 2 million, and then product liability insurance as well, which will vary. One thing I did want to point out, in all cases, insurance requirements, and actually this can apply to accreditations as well, should be proportionate to the value, risk and complexity of the contract. If for any reason that you don't believe it is, then you may question that insurance and the level that you're being asked to provide through the clarification question process. Also, the new regulations are making sure that if you do have to buy additional insurances, that you are, through the bid process, certifying that you will have the insurance in place for when the contract starts, that you don't necessarily have to have it in place for the point of bidding. And that's to try and take some pressure off having to put expenditure out before you've actually secured the work. Section 8 will also look at skills and apprenticeships. You might be asked to confirm if you're supporting apprenticeships and skill development through the contract. Now, the guidance on SSQ says that public procurement contracts with a full life value of 10 million and above and a duration of 12 months and above should be used to support skills development and delivery of apprenticeship commitments. So, you know, if you are bidding above 10 million, you'll definitely be asked about it, but it is often asked in smaller procurements as well as a demonstration of that social value commitment. There's lots of detail laid out in a procurement policy note 1415 if you want to read any more information on it. For larger contracts as well, you might also be asked about processes you have in place to ensure that your supply chain will support skill development and apprenticeships also, and you might be asked to provide evidence if required around those things. If the contract is concerned with the production or supply of steel, there will be questions on supply chain management, similar projects, breaches of health and safety, that kind of thing, where steel is the core product. And in Section 8, you might have some questions on supplier past performance, but that is only for central government contracting authorities. So the wider public sector potentially wouldn't be using that. And there are 5 questions in there that can be used. So can you supply a list of principal contracts? Can you provide certificates from customers? If you can't, why not? If the certificate states that goods and services were not satisfactory, can you show information why and how it won't reoccur? And can you supply any information of those 4 things for subcontractors if required also? So that's Section 8, and that completes actually the SSQ. We do have more video tutorials on bid skills in our YouTube channel, even if I can get my teeth in our bid skills playlist. So please do feel free to have a play around with there, and I will take some questions. It looks like there's a few in Q&A. So let me have a look. For audited accounts, is it correct that micro entity company returns are not audited and therefore an alternative needs to be provided? I think it's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. When we've been bidding and we're a micro organisation, I've been doing that for the last 10 years. We have always had unaudited accounts. We're a limited company drafted by our accountant. They've always been sufficient. So what we would normally do is ask a question that unaudited accounts from our accountant would be accepted, and they always have been. So in that case, I would ask a question if the wording is unaudited. Smaller organisations generally don't have audited accounts, but they've always been accepted in my experience. If that's helpful, Dan, thank you for that. And yes, so the legal rules sources, David, for the public sector procurement rules and notes, we'll put them out with the slide deck actually. So any of the links that I've talked about on the guidance of mandatory discretionary exclusions, they're part of a full document of guidance for all of the standard selection questionnaire. That's the government guidance that's public as it stands at the moment in the current regulatory environment. So we'll include all of that so you can see the sources that we have used for today's information. Anything we've used for today is publicly available. And of course, it's also from our opinion as practitioners. So if you've got any questions, you can, always come to us and we can talk more about it. Hopefully that's helpful. I'll just see if there are any more questions coming up on the Q&A. What time are we on? 55. Okay. Let me just see if there's any more coming through. Apologies about the chat functionality being disabled. I don't know why it was. I will have a look at that. But thank you for the questions that we've had today. Our contact details are on the screen. Please do feel free to drop a question either to myself or to my colleague Lauren. You can find lots of information on our website, and there is a link to our YouTube channel for lots of video tutorials in there. We have 3 more lunch and learns this month. So next Monday, my colleague Mike Fairbotham is hosting the session where we're looking at specification, evaluation criteria, and that kind of thing. He's also running the session on the 20th of March at 12:30, which is looking at key legal terms and conditions and what they might mean. And then the final session I'm running on the 27th, which is all about the feedback process. So please do feel free to register for those and join us if you can. So thank you again for joining. It will be a few days before we get the slide deck sent out. We do have some annual leave in the team this week, so if we're a little delayed, please don't worry, we will get them out to you within the next week. Thank you all for joining, and thank you very much. We'll see you all again soon.